So, you've survived the war, the weather, and the weird medieval diet of mostly bread and whatever you can find in the dirt. Congratulations, now comes the real challenge: staying alive without modern medicine. Welcome to medieval medicine, the world where doctors looked at your urine more than your face, and where your chances of survival often depended on how loud you could scream. 1. Doctors, part healer, part wizard. Medieval doctors were a curious breed. Most had little real medical training. Instead, they were part philosopher, part astrologer, and part snake oil salesman. Their main tools included herbs, think garlic, mint, and a pinch of whatever smells like it might work. Bloodletting tools, because bleeding was supposed to balance your humors, which were the medieval version of energy levels. Urine charts. Doctors literally judged your health by peeing in a cup and checking its color, smell, and taste. Yes, they tasted it. Prayers and charms. When all else failed, call on Saint whatever and hope for divine intervention. 2. The humors, medieval body science. The dominant medical theory was the 4 humors: blood phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Your health was thought to depend on the balance of these fluids. Too much black bile? You were probably doomed. So, doctors tried to balance you by making you vomit, sweat, or bleed until you looked like a medieval tomato. 3. Surgery. Brutal, brief, and mostly desperate surgery was a last resort, partly because anesthesia didn't exist, and partly because surgeons often didn't wash their hands. If you got surgery, expect lots of screaming. Yours. Primitive. Tools, saws, knives, and something resembling pliers. No painkillers, except maybe a swig of wine or a good curse. A hopeful prayer that infection didn't kill you afterward. Some brave souls even tried trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to release evil spirits. Spoiler, it often didn't help. 4. Disease. The real medieval plague disease was the #1 killer. Wars, famine, and crowded cities made perfect breeding grounds for plague, aka the Black Death, which wiped out nearly half of Europe's population. Smallpox, measles, and influenza, all terrifying without vaccines. Leprosy, misunderstood and feared, with sufferers often forced into isolated communities. People didn't know about germs. They thought disease was caused by bad smells or evil spirits. So the cure: burning incense, carrying herbs, or simply running away. 5. Hospitals, more like shelters. Medieval hospitals were often run by monks and nuns. They offered food, prayers, and a place to rest, but didn't usually have much medical care. If you made it into a hospital, you were lucky. At least you'd be somewhere warm and maybe get a clean bandage. But survival depended mostly on your immune system and sheer luck. 6. Public health. Lessons. Not learned cities smelled terrible, thanks to open sewers, trash piles, and animals roaming freely. Laws about waste disposal existed, but they were rarely enforced. Drinking water, often contaminated. Bathing, rare, unless you wanted to catch something worse. 7. The end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of modern medicine. The Renaissance started changing things. People began questioning old ideas, experimenting, and slowly moving towards scientific medicine. But for most of the Middle Ages, it was a brutal, desperate struggle to stay alive. Final thoughts. Why we're lucky to be here now. Looking back, medieval life sounds like a nightmare buffet of dangers, but people survived, built cathedrals, wrote poetry, and shaped the world we live in. So next time you complain about waiting at the doctor's office, remember, You're living in an age where doctors don't taste your pee, and a broken bone doesn't mean game over. Thanks for joining this journey through the Middle Ages. If you ever want to explore other times, places, or stories with humor and history, just say the word. Would you like me to package all parts together in one file, or help with any additional touches like intros, outros, or narration tips? So, you've been called to war. Maybe your king's mad at someone else's king. Maybe a pope promised you eternal salvation if you stab enough infidels. Or maybe your local lord just got bored and decided your peaceful village needs a little more pillaging. Welcome to medieval warfare, where strategy is optional, hygiene is non-existent, and arrows are very real. Let's unsheathe this mess. Who's fighting whom, and why? War in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly rare. In fact, it was basically the national sport. The reasons varied. Territory disputes. That field is mine, even though I've never been there. Inheritance crises. I'm the real heir because my grandmother said so in Latin. Religion. God told me to conquer your city and your sheep. Personal grudges. Your dog barked at my horse, time to invade. Wars could last months, years, or generations, and no one ever seemed to learn a lesson except maybe bring more socks. The army. A beautiful, filthy messer medieval army wasn't a sleek professional force. It was more like a chaotic camping trip with weapons. You had knights, the rich guys in armor, looked cool, smelled awful. Men-at-arms, semi-professional fighters, basically the medieval equivalent of security contractors. Peasant levies, poor farmers given pointy sticks and told, try not to die. Camp followers, cooks, blacksmiths, wives, kids, and people who heard war and thought good business opportunity. Logistics were a nightmare, food spoiled, horses died, soldiers deserted, and nobody could agree on where to pitch the latrine. Weapons. Everything sharp and shouty. Let's take inventory. Swords. Expensive, flashy, and not nearly as common as Hollywood says. Spears and pikes. Cheap, effective, and ideal for stabbing horse guys in the guts. Bows. The longbow was England's favorite cheat code. Crossbows were easier, deadlier, and considered very rude by the church. Axes, maces, and flails. Great for smashing armor. Less great for finesse. Siege weapons. More on that below, but let's just say, if it launches rocks, fire, or cows, it's medieval approved. Armor. Also diverse. Chainmail, the metal hoodie of warfare. Plate armor, fashionable but heavy. A full set could make you look like a walking teapot. Battles. Mostly standing around, then screaming. Despite what movies show, medieval battles were not endless sword-swinging ballet dances. They were more like this. Step 1. March for days. Step 2. Stand in a field glaring at each other. Step 3. Someone's horse farts and everyone panics. Step 4. Chaos. Real fighting lasted minutes or hours, not days. Most injuries didn't come from swordplay. They came from being trampled, falling, or catching disease before the battle even started. Also, friendly fire. Very real. There were no team uniforms. Everyone just hoped their buddies wouldn't stab them by mistake. Sieges. The slowest, smelliest way to win. Sometimes you didn't fight on an open field. You fought a castle, a giant stone box filled with angry people and boiling oil. Sieges were slow, miserable, and mostly about waiting for the other side to starve, cry, or catch dysentery. Tactics included starvation, cut off food and wait, like a passive-aggressive roommate. Tunneling, dig under the walls and collapse them. It worked until the defenders figured out they could burn you alive in your own tunnel. Siege towers, basically ladders with ambition. Trebuchets, medieval artillery capable of launching 90-kilo rocks over 300 meters, sometimes used to fling plague-ridden corpses. Because why just kill your enemy when you can biohazard them? Defenders threw boiling water, oil, rocks, and insults. Once, in Jerusalem, defenders even used beehives as missiles. Nature is terrifying. Naval warfare. Let's just crash into each other. Naval battles in the Middle Ages were less master and commander, and more bumper boats with crossbows. Tactics included boarding enemy ships, because who needs cannons when you can just leap over and start stabbing? Greek fire, a terrifying, sticky, flaming substance that could burn on water, basically ancient napalm. Ramming, less effective on bigger ships, but still fun in a reckless, chaotic kind of way. Sailors weren't always trained, and many navies were hastily assembled merchant ships with a prayer and a goat on board. For luck. The aftermath. Looting, disease, and sudden nobility. Surviving the battle didn't mean your problems were over. Armies looted everything in sight, including innocent villages. Soldiers rarely got paid properly, so taking stuff became part of the job description. And then came the real killer. Disease. After every battle, people got sick. From infected wounds, from bad food, from corpses lying around like grim, medieval confetti. On the bright side, if you did well, you might be knighted, land rich, or at least not dead. Always a win. The Crusades. Holy War, horrible logistics. Special mention goes to the Crusades, a long-running series of wars that combined religious fervor with military chaos. Tens of thousands of Europeans marched to the Holy Land, driven by promises of salvation, land, or a break from local taxes. They encountered scorching deserts, superior Muslim forces, and very confused camels. Some crusaders never even made it to Jerusalem. They died en route from starvation, disease, or poor map reading. One crusade even attacked the wrong city entirely. Medieval GPS was just yelling east and hoping for the best. Chivalry, noble ideals, questionable practice. Knights were supposed to follow chivalry, a code of honor, bravery, and protecting the innocent. In practice, many knights followed the much simpler code of hit stuff, get paid. Sure, some were noble defenders of justice. Others stabbed monks, burned villages, and used chivalry as a PR stunt, like modern influencers, but with more swords and fewer brand deals. So, medieval warfare. Brutal, smelly, confusing, and almost never glorious. Next time you rage quit a video game because of lag, imagine being a peasant with a rusty spear and no clue why you're bleeding from the face. This chapter is all about medieval justice, a system so absurd it makes modern bureaucracy look like a spa day. Word count. 1,000 words. Part 8. Medieval justice, trials, torture, and duck-based legal strategy. So you've committed a crime in medieval Europe, or more likely, someone said you did. Maybe your cow wandered into the Lord's garden. Maybe you sneezed during Mass. Maybe you're just a woman with opinions. Congratulations! It's time for medieval justice, where logic is optional, due process is developing, and your fate might depend on how well you float. Let's dive. Ian Bont 1. The law, as written by someone who hated you. Medieval laws were a chaotic cocktail of feudal custom, royal decree, church mandates, and whatever the local lord dreamt up after too much ale. There was no unified code of laws. You could be innocent in one village and a criminal in the next, just for wearing green on a Tuesday or owning a pig with the same name as the king's cousin. If that sounds ridiculous, congratulations, you're thinking like a modern person. In the Middle Ages, justice was more about keeping order than being fair, and sometimes keeping order meant breaking knees. Justice for peasants. Quick, brutal, and very public. If you were a commoner and someone accused you of stealing, blaspheming, or looking at the bailiff funny, you could expect one of the following: A. Public humiliation. The stocks were the medieval version of social media. Public, humiliating, and full of people throwing things. Offenders were locked in place for hours or days, during which villagers could hurl rotten vegetables, insults, and the occasional sharp object. Fun for the whole family. B. Fines couldn't pay. No problem. The court would just take your land, your animals, your shoes, or your children's inheritance. Justice is expensive, especially when the local lord gets a cut. C. Corporal punishment, whippings, brandings, ear removal. You name it, they mutilated it. The idea was simple. If you break the rules, we break you. Trial by ordeal. The original game show, for more serious crimes like murder, heresy, or being a woman who knew math, you might face a trial by ordeal. Here are your top 3 thrilling options. A. Ordeal by water. You're tied up and thrown into a river. If you float, it means the water rejected you. Guilty. If you sink, you're innocent, but also possibly dead. Medieval logic. Airtight. B. Ordeal by fire. You hold a red-hot iron or walk across burning coals. Then your wound is wrapped. After 3 days, if it's healing nicely, you're innocent. If it's festering, you're guilty. Surgeons not included. C. Ordeal by combat. 2. People fight to the death, or until one gives up. God presumably helps the innocent win. Great if you're a knight. Less great if you're a 60-year-old chicken farmer being accused by a bored mercenary with a sword the size of a canoe. Church courts. Holier, but still awful. If you were a clergyman, you could claim benefit of clergy and get tried in church courts, which were more lenient than secular ones. But wait, what if you're not a priest? No problem. Just memorize a psalm and recite it in court. If you did it well enough, they assumed you were clergy. This little hack became known as the neck verse, because it could literally save your neck. Church courts rarely use torture or executions. Instead, they handed out punishments like pilgrimages, go walk 500 miles, fasting, not so fun when you're already starving, whipping, yes that too, but more sacred. Torture, because facts are overrated. Torture wasn't used in every case, but when it was efficiently horrifying. Common tools included the rack, for stretching you like medieval taffy, the thumbscrews, self-explanatory, the Iron Maiden, possibly apocryphal, but terrifying anyway, hot pokers, no relation to the card game. Torture wasn't just punishment, it was a method of interrogation, which is wild considering that screaming yes while your limbs are on fire isn't exactly a reliable confession. Animal trials. Yes, this happened. The Middle Ages was a time of rich imagination and very poor logic. There are actual records of animals being tried in court. Pigs, rats, and even insects. A pig that killed a child might be dressed in clothes, put on trial, and executed. Locusts could be excommunicated for ruining crops. Rats were once given legal counsel and a formal court summons. Somehow, this is both hilarious and deeply upsetting. Punishments for nobles. Light slaps, heavy taxes. If you were rich or noble, the justice system came with pillows and exits. Instead of being whipped or executed, you might be sent to a luxurious house arrest in your own castle. Pay a massive fine and call it a day, join a crusade as punishment, which was just a vacation with stabbing nobles, rarely faced the same harshness as peasants. Why? Because executing a noble was politically messy, and money, as always, made everything go away. Execution. Entertainment for the masses. If your crime was serious enough, or your social status low enough, it was time for the final show. Common methods of execution included hanging, quick-ish. Unless they messed up the rope, beheading, clean, if the executioner was sober. Burning at the stake, especially for heretics or witches drawn and quartered, for traitors, and also for people who were apparently too intact. Executions were public events, complete with food vendors, children, and cheers. Nothing like a good old medieval beheading to bring the community together. 9. Prisons. Less Alcatraz, more dungeon. Airbnb. You might be surprised to learn that prisons were rarely the punishment. They were where you waited to be punished. Medieval jails were dark, damp, disease-ridden, and occasionally full of rats, smart enough to represent themselves in court. If you wanted out, your best bet was to bribe the guards, escape, or hope the king needed someone for an expendable military mission. So, next time you get a parking ticket or jury duty, remember, at least you're not being judged by a bucket of water or forced to prove your innocence by being set on fire. This chapter dives into medieval jobs. The honest, back-breaking, sometimes revolting ways people made a living. Word count. 1,000 words. Part 7. Careers in the Middle Ages, so you want to be a gong farmer. Welcome to the medieval job market, where ambition meets necessity, and your career options range from back-breaking labor to smells like trauma. Forget LinkedIn. Your best networking tool in the 14th century is your last name. That's right. Names like Smith, Baker, Fletcher, and Cooper all tell the world what your ancestors did. And let's be honest, nobody was named Sir Chad, middle manager of finance. Let's break down some of the most common, unusual, and downright terrifying jobs of the time. The blacksmith. Every town had a blacksmith, and every blacksmith had arms like tree trunks. They made horseshoes, weapons, tools, armor, and occasionally the entire personality of every fantasy RPG character ever. Blacksmithing was hot, loud, and exhausting. You stood in front of a blazing forge, swinging hammers all day while inhaling. More smoke than a campfire influencer. Still, it paid well. People respected the blacksmith. He was the medieval version of an engineer, a mechanic, and a gym bro rolled into one. The miller flour doesn't grow on trees, and bread doesn't bake itself. That's where the miller came in. Mills were powered by water, wind, or occasionally oxen, all of which were slightly more reliable than your average medieval cart. Millers had a reputation. They were essential, yes, but also suspect. Why? Because they handled grain and measured flour, and there was always the chance they'd skim a little off the top. Result: every village loved their bread and mildly hated their miller. The tanner, if you enjoy working with your hands, being outdoors, and the smell of rotting flesh, tanning might be for you. Tanners turned animal hides into leather. But first, those hides had to soak in a mixture of urine, animal brains, and dog feces. Yes, you heard that right. The job involved literal buckets of filth, and the stench was so legendary that tanneries were always built downwind and downstream. On the bright side, no one bothered you at parties, or anywhere. The gong farmer? Ah yes, the hero we didn't deserve. A gong was medieval slang for human waste, and a gong farmer was the poor soul tasked with cleaning cesspits, privies and latrines. Armed with a bucket, shovel, and a deep, existential crisis, the gong farmer waded into the muck beneath castles and cities to shovel out the unmentionable. But here's the twist. It paid really well. Why? Because literally no one else wanted to do it. Gong farmers were paid handsomely, worked mostly at night, and sometimes lived surprisingly well, assuming they didn't drown in it. That actually happened, more than once. The alewife women brewed most of the beer in medieval Europe. If you made good ale, you could earn coin, reputation, and the undying love of thirsty peasants. Alewives worked out of their homes, boiling grain in enormous cauldrons and fermenting batches in open air, barrels. Regulations were loose, and sometimes the beer came with a bonus, like twigs, insects, or hallucinations. Still, ale was safer than water, and if you were good at it, you could rise in status. Unless the beer spoiled, then you got fined, shamed, or accused of witchcraft. Tough gig. The reeve think of the reeve. As the middle manager of the village, he made sure taxes were collected, fields were tended, and everybody did their job. No one liked the reeve. He wasn't quite a noble, but he wasn't quite a peasant either. He was stuck in bureaucratic limbo, wielding petty power like a medieval parking officer. Reeves often took bribes, settled disputes, and occasionally vanished in the night, when things got a little too stabby and armour. The fletcher and the bowyer. If you've got steady hands and an eye for detail, you might end up as a fletcher who made arrows, or a bowyer who made bows. These were precision craftsmen. Arrows had to fly straight, and bows had to withstand tension without snapping your fingers off. Good fletchers were in high demand during wartime. Bad fletchers were blamed when your arrow hit a tree instead of a Frenchman. The knight. You might think knights were all chivalry and dragons, but being a knight was a job, and like most jobs, it involved paperwork, bad bosses, and a lot of sitting around waiting to be told what to do. Yes, they trained from a young age and wore shiny armor, but most of their time was spent guarding roads, collecting taxes, smelling like horse, and occasionally getting knocked off their mount by a peasant with a rakesaw. Jousting looked cool, but the reality was closer to being an underpaid security guard with a sword and a debt problem. The peasanter, the backbone of society, the field worker, the beast of burden, the one who actually made sure everyone else got to eat. Peasants farmed from dawn to dusk, paid taxes to the Lord, tithes to the church, and prayed to every saint on the calendar just to survive another year. Jobs included sowing and harvesting, tending livestock, fixing tools, dying young. Most peasants never travelled more than 10 miles from their village. Their reward for a life of toil, a slightly less leaky roof, and the eternal hope that the next harvest wouldn't suck. Set. The professional beggar. If you couldn't farm, craft, or bribe your way into the church, there was always the begging circuit. Some beggars were genuinely disabled. Others were, shall we say, theatrically inclined. Fake wounds, sob stories, and dramatic flops into the street were standard techniques. Cities sometimes issued begging licenses, proving once again that bureaucracy has always found a way to make poverty even more complicated. Bonus: rat catcher, executioner, and town crier rat catchers made their living chasing fleas on legs. Executioners had job security and social isolation, and the town crier was your walking newsfeed, yelling announcements and ringing a bell. Basically, the medieval Twitter feed, just louder and slightly more accurate. So, what'll it be? Will you be a respected blacksmith, a mysterious bowyer, a brave gong farmer swimming in coin and excrement? Whatever your path, remember, medieval careers didn't come with dental, PTO, or HR, just blisters, bruises, and the faint smell of sheep. Let's say you've survived the plague, the famine, and the siege. Congratulations. You're now one of the lucky few who get to experience medieval healthcare. Spoiler: it's going to hurt. So, you wake up in the year 1349 with a sore throat, swollen glands, and a strange bump on your leg that's starting to smell like regret. What do? Well, if you're rich, you call a physician. If you're poor, you call a barber. And if you're really unlucky, you call God, because your odds aren't great either way. Let's start with the physicians. These guys wore long robes, spoke Latin, and studied the works of ancient scholars like Hippocrates, Galen, and some guy who once sneezed near a scroll. They believed your body was governed by 4 humors: blood, hot and wet; phlegm, cold and wet; yellow bile, hot and dry; black bile, cold and dry. If you were sick, clearly one of these was out of balance. Too much blood? Time for bloodletting. Too much phlegm. Eat something spicy and purge. Too much black bile. Good luck. Nobody even knew what it was. Bloodletting was the go-to cure for everything from fever to heartbreak. You'd get cut with a knife or leeched until you were woozy, pale, and hopefully too tired to complain. Fun fact: leeches weren't just gross, they were expensive. A top-quality leech could cost as much as a chicken. That's luxury bleeding. Now, if you couldn't afford a physician, you might visit a barber surgeon. Yes, the same guy who gave you a bowl cut also removed arrowheads, pulled teeth, and performed amputations. The red and white barber pole, that's not just branding. It represents red, blood, white, bandages, twisting pole, thing you held, while screaming surgery in the Middle Ages had all the finesse of a tavern brawl. Anesthesia? Nope. Sterilization? Never heard of it. Hand washing? Sounds suspiciously French. Your options were bite a stick, scream into a pillow, pass out, and hope the guy remembered what he was doing. Wounds were treated with wine, if available, honey, if you were lucky, or just cauterized with a hot iron, because burning it shut was the medieval version of duct tape. Let's talk about hospitals. Today, hospitals are clean, high-tech centers of care. Back then, they were often run by monks and nuns, with more focus on saving your soul than your spleen. Treatment included prayer, herbal compresses, quiet reflection, sharing a bed with 5 strangers and several rats. If you were dying, and most patients were, at least someone would hold your hand and whisper prayers until the end. That's kind of nice. In a "this is the best we've got" kind of way. Now, on the science front, things were complicated. People in the Middle Ages weren't stupid. They just had really bad source material and no microscopes. For example, they knew herbs could help. Willow bark for pain, garlic for infections, mint for digestion. Modern science eventually proved them right, but they were guessing. They observed anatomy, usually by dissecting pigs, because dissecting humans was considered heretical unless you were lucky enough to find a fresh criminal. Astronomy was big. Everyone thought the stars influenced your health. Physicians might cast a horoscope before diagnosing your cough. Mercury in retrograde. That's why your toe fell off. Alchemy was a mix of chemistry, philosophy, and wishful thinking. Mostly, they tried to turn lead into gold and live forever. Spoiler, they didn't succeed at either. But there were breakthroughs. Arabic and Persian scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi preserved and expanded ancient medical knowledge. Translations of their work slowly made it to Europe via Spain, inspiring more accurate anatomy and better treatments. And by the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe saw the rise of medical universities, where young men could study for years and still prescribe, "Put a pigeon on it." Yes, that was a real thing. For certain illnesses, physicians recommended tying a live pigeon to your feet or chest, rubbing animal dung on your wounds, or wearing jewels because apparently sapphires cured fevers. They didn't, but you looked fabulous. Mental health, that was either demonic possession, melancholy, or too much reading. Treatments included whipping, pilgrimage, or exorcism, preferably all three. Women healers, midwives, and wise women were often the most effective medical practitioners in a village. Naturally, this made them targets for accusations of witchcraft, especially if the patient survived. "Oh, your broken leg healed without turning black and falling off. Must be sorcery." So, let's summarize medieval medicine. Did they try? Yes. Did they base their methods on observation and experience? Sometimes. Did they bleed people for headaches and slap birds on their chest? Absolutely. But despite all the superstition, leeches, and prayers, the Middle Ages laid the groundwork for modern medicine. Hospitals, universities, medical ethics, and the very radical idea that maybe you should wash your hands before surgery. Progress was slow, messy, and frequently on fire, but it happened. Let's say you've survived your trial by fire, you're not in a dungeon, and you've avoided marrying your cousin. Nice work. Unfortunately, the Middle Ages has one final challenge for you: everything else. Welcome to the part of history where death doesn't knock politely. It kicks in the door, throws your dinner on the floor, and sets your goat on fire. Let's start with the classic plague. You've probably heard of the Black Death. It wasn't a bad day. It was a decade-long apocalyptic horror show that wiped out somewhere between 1/3 and half of Europe's population in the 14th century. How did it start? Well, picture this. A rat sitting on a merchant ship covered in fleas. Those fleas carry Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that causes plague. That ship docks in Sicily in 1347, and the rest is just one long, coughing, corpse-stacking disaster. The symptoms: fever, vomiting, swollen lymph nodes the size of apples, death within a week. If you were really unlucky, you got the pneumonic variety, airborne and deadlier. Even worse, the septicemic kind, which just skipped the drama and killed you in a day. Doctors at the time wore those spooky plague doctor masks, which looked like evil bird beaks. Inside, dried flowers and herbs. Why? Because they thought bad smells caused disease. That's right, they believed in miasma or naughty air. Actual treatments included bloodletting, leeches, sitting next to a fire, drinking crushed emeralds. Spoiler, none of it worked. The church said it was God's punishment. Some people thought it was caused by the stars. Others blamed Jews, leading to horrific massacres and expulsions, because what's medieval Europe without a side of xenophobia? But even when there wasn't plague, there was always famine. The 14th century alone hosted the Great Famine of 1315-1317. A lovely period where crops failed, livestock died, and eating your horse wasn't just a joke, it was dinner. Why? A combination of terrible weather, crop blights, overworked land, population boom that outpaced food production, and when there was no food, people got desperate. Reports included eating bark, eating leather, eating each other. Yes, cannibalism was whispered about, even if rarely admitted. Grain prices tripled, bakers were hanged for cheating, and meat could mean whatever's not moving too fast. So you're starving, the plague's back for round 2, and now, surprise, war. The Middle Ages was one long, slow knife fight interrupted by the occasional wedding, want a war, take your pick, the 100 Years' War, which, fun fact, actually lasted 116 years because math was also suffering. The Crusades, a series of expensive and mostly disastrous road trips to the Holy Land. Local, feudal feuds. Because if your neighbour's sheep wandered into your yard, clearly the solution was to light his granary on fire. If you were a peasant, war meant this. You're conscripted into service. You're armed with a stick and told to follow the guy in armour. Or worse, you're not in the army, but the army comes to you, tramples your field, steals your grain, and calls it campaign logistics. Armies weren't professional. They were mobs of angry, hungry men, often unpaid, who foraged for supplies, which meant robbing everyone in sight. And knights, they weren't noble paragons of chivalry. More often, they were heavily armoured bullies who thought jousting over land disputes was a personality trait. Battles were chaotic, muddy, and brutal. Swords bent, arrows rained, horses screamed, and most of the fighting happened after someone fell down and couldn't get back up. Sieges were worse. Picture this: a castle under siege. No one in, no one out. You're inside, eating rats and boiling leather boots while the enemy catapults diseased corpses over the walls. Sanitation, not a priority. Morale, at an all-time low, and if the defenders surrendered, the attackers might still loot, pillage, and torch the place anyway. You know, for closure. Now let's add some natural disasters just for fun. Floods wiped out whole harvests. Droughts turned fields to dust. A comet in the sky, clearly a sign that God was super mad. And through it all, medieval folks coped the only way they knew how. Faith, pray harder, fast longer, maybe this time God will take pity. Superstition, hang charms, chant spells, burn a witch, just in case. Alcohol, ale for breakfast, wine for lunch, mead if you're lucky. Dancing plagues, yes, actual events where people danced uncontrollably for hours or days, probably caused by ergot poisoning, a lovely fungus on rye that mimics LSD. But still, peak weirdness. And if all else failed, they blamed the devil. Because when your cow dies, your child coughs, and your roof falls in during a storm, clearly Satan has been very busy in your village. So to recap, famine kept your belly empty. Plague kept your body weak. War kept your land trampled. And, somehow, people still managed to build cathedrals, write epic poetry, and develop the foundations of modern law and government. Why? Because despite everything, humans are stubborn. And medieval humans were cockroach-level indestructible. So the next time your Wi-Fi cuts out, and you think you're having a rough day, just remember, you could be ankle-deep in mud, swinging a hoe, praying not to catch the plague again while your village burns in the distance. So you've married your second cousin, survived the pox, and managed not to die in childbirth. Congrats. Now let's talk about crime. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't have police. You had local lords, church courts, mob justice, and exactly zero understanding of forensic science. If you woke up with a knife in your back, The local investigator was probably just your neighbor holding a stick, squinting at footprints in the mud and saying, "Looks like goblins." Let's begin with the basics. Crime categories in medieval times were charmingly brutal. Petty theft, like stealing a loaf of bread or some firewood. Grand theft, like stealing a horse, which was basically medieval Grand Theft Auto. Poaching, taking the king's deer, super illegal, could get you blinded. Seriously, blasphemy, saying rude things about the church or God, even if your cow died and you were just venting. Witchcraft, basically, being a woman who knows things. Murder, as today, frowned upon, but depending on your social rank, might not be that big of a deal. Justice was not blind. Justice was drunk, armed with a rusty axe, and wildly inconsistent. If you were a peasant, justice meant being judged by a bunch of other peasants with pitchforks and poor vision. If you were a noble, you might get a nice indoor trial with candles, wine, and several bribes. One of the most exciting features of medieval justice was the trial by ordeal. Sounds bad? Oh, it was. Here are just a few flavors. Trial by hot iron. Hold a red-hot metal bar and walk 3 steps. Then they bandage your hand. 3 days later, if your wound isn't infected, you're innocent, because God loves clean burns, apparently. Trial by water. Get tied up and thrown in a river. If you float, you're guilty because water rejects. Sinners. If you sink, you're innocent and probably dead. Win-win. Trial by combat. You fight someone to prove who's telling the truth. It could be your accuser, a hired champion, or your elderly neighbor. God, apparently, acts as referee. Trial by bread. Yes, this is real. A priest accused of something might have to eat holy bread and swallow without choking. If he chokes, guilty. If he doesn't, still guilty, but now full. Once convicted, the punishment buffet began, and it was gloriously creative. Let's sample some medieval hits. Stocks and pillories. You're locked into wooden boards in the town square so people can throw rotten vegetables and occasionally pigs at you. Whipping. Public, of course. It was like medieval reality TV, free, messy, and sponsored by deep societal trauma. Branding. Some criminals were marked for life, often on the face. So every time someone asked, "What does that T mean?" you had to admit you once stole a goat. Mutilation. Steal something. Lose a hand. Commit adultery. Lose. Well, depends on the mood of the judge. Hanging. The go-to punishment. Fast, cheap, and doesn't require much paperwork. Boiling alive. Rare, but technically on the menu. Usually for poisoners or people the king was really mad at. Being drawn and quartered. Reserved for traitors. You're hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, chopped into quarters, and your limbs sent to different cities. It's like medieval UPS. And then there's public shaming. Medieval people loved it. You didn't just get punished, you got punished loudly, in front of everyone. Did you gossip too much? They might slap a scold's bridle on your head. A spiky metal muzzle with a tongue clamp. Very fashionable. Cheating at dice. Into the pillory, selling watered-down ale, whipped and dunked in a giant barrel for dramatic flair. But not all courts were secular. The church had its own courts, where sins like adultery, heresy, and eating meat on Fridays were judged. These trials were more bureaucratic, less bloody, but could still end with excommunication, branding, or getting burned at the stake if things escalated. On the flip side, the church offered sanctuary. If you committed a crime and made it into a church before angry villagers caught you, you could claim sanctuary. You'd stay there for 40 days, eating scraps and hoping everyone forgot you beheaded their uncle. Spoiler: they didn't. So, were there any law enforcement officials? Kind of. You had the constable, usually just a dude from town with a stick and a bad attitude. The reeve, a local enforcer, often hated, always underpaid. The watchman. They patrolled at night and shouted things like "all's well," even when it wasn't. Witch hunters. Self-appointed lunatics who really hated women with herbal knowledge. Most of the time, though, if something bad happened, it was up to you to report it, investigate it, arrest the person, and drag them to court yourself. Hope you like multitasking. And speaking of criminals, what about jails? Forget Netflix and prison cafeterias. Medieval jails were dark, wet holes in the ground. You weren't sent there as punishment. You were locked up while waiting for your real punishment, usually execution, a fine, or being paraded around in a donkey costume. Fun fact, rich criminals could actually pay for better cells. Some had beds, food, even servants. So yes, VIP prison existed. Now here's the twist. Despite all this chaos, many medieval villages were pretty peaceful. Why? Because everyone knew everyone. If you stole a chicken, it wasn't anonymous. It was like, "Oi, Gareth, bring back my hen," and Gareth would awkwardly return it with an apology and half a pie. Justice was brutal, but crime didn't always run wild because social pressure, combined with the looming threat of public whipping, was surprisingly effective. So next time you forget to pay a parking ticket, just be glad you're not in 14th century England being judged by a man named Ethelred who thinks witches live in his soup. So, you've survived medieval hygiene. Your teeth are hanging on. Your chamber pot hasn't exploded. Life is acceptable, but now your parents are giving you that look. That you're 14 and still unmarried? Look, welcome to medieval romance. A world where love letters are replaced by livestock negotiations, and your soulmate is probably your second cousin, if you're lucky. Let's begin with a crucial fact. Marriage in the Middle Ages was rarely about love. It was about land, alliances, and the highly romantic concept of not dying alone in a ditch. If you're a peasant, marriage is practical. You need someone to help you till fields, raise children, and survive another winter without eating your shoe. If you're a noble, marriage is strategy. It's a game of dynasties, dowries, and hoping the family you're marrying into doesn't have a secret history of plague. So how do people meet? Well, not at candlelit taverns. Most people didn't travel far from their villages. You probably knew your future spouse since they were a toddler eating dirt next to you. And yet, courtship did exist. It just looked a little different. If you were a peasant lad, you might show interest in a girl by carving her a wooden spoon, helping her family during harvest, staring awkwardly at her across the village green like a medieval high school dance. Flirting involved compliments like, "Your goats are plump this year," or "I like how you thresh grain." Swoon. Among the nobility, things were fancier and way more complicated. You didn't choose your spouse. Your parents, uncles, and family priest did. It was like Tinder, if Tinder required 3 bishops and a treaty. Betrothals could happen at birth. Imagine being 6 years old and already engaged to someone you haven't met because your dad needs sheep. And weddings, oh boy. If you're imagining a grand cathedral, white dresses, and emotional vows, forget it. Most marriages were legally binding the moment 2 people exchanged vows in front of witnesses. No priest necessary. You could get married in a field, in a kitchen, or in your underwear. As long as you said the words, boom, congratulations, you're married in 12. This brings us to one of the most medieval things about the Middle Ages. The age of consent. Brace yourself. It was horrifyingly low. Technically, girls could be married at 12 and boys at 14. In practice, most waited longer, because even medieval people thought marrying a child was a bit much, but the fact that it was allowed is enough to make your skin crawl. Now, once you were married, your job was to produce heirs, lots of them, because 3 out of 5 kids would probably die before age 5, and your family needed backup. So your life becomes a cycle of childbirth, fieldwork, and dodging dysentery. But what if you don't like your spouse? Tough. Divorce was basically impossible. The church didn't allow it. You could try to get your marriage annulled, but only if you could prove something dramatic, like your partner being a secret cousin, or already married to someone else, or technically dead. Instead, people got creative. If you were rich and miserable, you might pay the church to let you live separately. If you were poor, you just stayed married and hated each other quietly until one of you got the plague. And yet, love did exist. Real, sappy, romantic love. Just not where you'd expect it. Enter the world of courtly love. This was a noble tradition where knights fell in love with unavailable noblewomen, usually someone else's wife. But instead of doing anything about it, they just wrote poems, stared longingly from a distance, and maybe died in a duel for her honor. Courtly love was all about passion with zero touching. It was romance as sport. A knight might wear a lady's favor, a ribbon, a glove, into battle. He'd pledge himself to her. She'd ignore him politely. It was the medieval version of simping, but with swords. But let's say you weren't noble. What if you just wanted a little companionship? Enter medieval dating alternatives. You had fairs and festivals, where young people could mingle under the suspicious eye of everyone's grandma. May Day celebrations, where dances around the maypole occasionally turned into dances into the bushes. Alehouses, where bad decisions were made nightly and regret was always on tap. Premarital sex happened. A lot. So much, in fact, that some places had informal trial marriages where couples cohabitated before tying the knot. If a child resulted, the church would often retroactively bless the union because, no harm, no foul. There were also brothels. Entire districts in cities were designated for the world's oldest profession. These places were taxed, regulated, and, surprise, frequently used by the clergy who preached against them on Sundays. Love in the Middle Ages was messy, restricted, and almost always tangled in class, religion, and mortality. But somehow, people still fell in love. Real, goofy, irrational love. They sang songs, exchanged tokens, snuck glances across crowded markets. They risked scandal for secret meetings. They carved their initials into trees before it was cool. Because at the end of the day, whether you're in the year 1200 or scrolling dating apps in 2025, humans are still hopeless romantics. Still foolish. Still looking for someone to share the winter with, even if that someone also smells like turnips. So, you've made it through your medieval morning routine, which, let's be honest, mostly involves not dying before lunch. But now we need to talk about something that gets a lot of romanticizing in movies and zero romanticizing in actual reality personal hygiene. Let's start with the basics. Bathing. Did people in the Middle Ages bathe? Yes, just not often, and certainly not the way you're thinking. The idea of daily showers with scented soap and exfoliating scrubs. That's not just unrealistic, it's heresy. Water was often dirty, cold, and in cities, not even remotely drinkable. So washing in it wasn't always a smart move. If you lived in the countryside, you might dunk yourself in a river occasionally. If you lived in a town, there might be a public bathhouse, until the church started side-eyeing those places for being too sexy. You see, by the later Middle Ages, the church wasn't thrilled with people being naked in groups, even if it was. For hygiene, bathhouses got a bit of a reputation, and not the good kind. So, what replaced them? Dry washing. That's right, cleaning yourself with cloth, herbs, or just changing your shirt and pretending it counts. Some folks used vinegar rubs, or wiped their bodies with scented oils, which basically just turned them into salad dressing with BO. But don't worry, you wouldn't notice how bad you smelled, because everyone smelled bad. There's a sort of social camouflage when everyone stinks. It's only noticeable when someone doesn't stink, which would be deeply suspicious. Now let's talk about teeth. Medieval dental hygiene was creative. People did brush their teeth. Sort of. They used cloths, chewed herbs like mint or sage, or rubbed ashes and salt on their gums. Some even used honey, which sounds lovely until you remember. Honey is sugar. Sugar is bad for teeth, and medieval dentistry had exactly zero chill. If you had a toothache, your options were live with it, get it yanked out by someone with no formal training and a pair of pliers, anesthetics. Forget it. You got a swig of wine and maybe a stick to bite down on. The town barber might pull it for you, because yes, barbers doubled as surgeons. Let that sink in. You walk in for a haircut. You walk out missing a molar and half your dignity. And now, for the most sensitive of subjects. Yes, we're going there. Toilets. What do you do when nature calls in a world with no plumbing? The answer: hope. In villages, you might have a cesspit, a deep hole in the ground with a wooden seat over it. Congratulations, you've invented the medieval porta potty. You empty it once in a while by paying someone called a gong farmer, a brave soul who shovels human waste for a living. Gong farmers were mostly nocturnal, mostly miserable, and 100% underpaid. In castles, you had a garderobe, a little stone room that jutted out over the wall. You sat down, did your business, and let gravity do the rest. Waste plummeted into the moat below. Very eco-friendly, also very gross. Urban areas. Oh, you're gonna love this. People often dumped waste directly into the street. Chamber pots were emptied from windows, usually with a shout of "Gardiloo," which loosely translates to "Look out below, I'm throwing poop." And yes, sometimes people didn't shout. Sometimes you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and boom, surprise, medieval baptism. Which brings us to toilet paper. Or should we say, the lack of it. What did people use? Moss, rags, leaves, hay, their hands, smooth stones, no, really. Basically, anything not nailed down, and even some things that were. Now let's pivot to medicine. Surely they had something to treat all these unwashed bodies and questionable diets, right? Well, sort of. Medieval medicine was a delightful blend of superstition, guesswork, and good intentions. Most cures came from ancient texts, the stars, or whatever the local herbalist could dig up in the woods. Ever heard of the four humours? According to medieval science, your body was governed by 4 bodily fluids: blood phlegm, black bile; yellow bile, feeling sick. One of your humours is out of balance. Too much blood? Let's cut you open and drain some. Congratulations, you've just been bled by a leech. Or a knife. Got a fever? That's an excess of yellow bile. Obviously. Eat a cold salad and avoid spicy thoughts. Coughing? Definitely a demon. Try some powdered toad and say a prayer. There were real physicians, of course, mostly trained in universities, often influenced by ancient Greek and Arabic texts. But they were rare, expensive, and often wrong. For everyone else, there were apothecaries, herbalists, or your friendly local wise woman. Did any of it work? Sometimes. Herbal medicine wasn't all bad. People used willow bark for pain relief, which actually contains salicin, a compound related to aspirin. They made poultices for wounds, brewed teas for stomach aches, and swore by garlic, onions, and vinegar for pretty much everything. Unfortunately, they also believed in astrology, bloodletting, and that sneezing too hard could jostle your soul loose. And when all else failed, there was prayer. Because when the doctor can't help you and the barber is holding a saw, it's time to talk to God. So, let's recap. You bathe maybe once a month. Your teeth are falling out. Your toilet is a hole. Your medical care involves frogs, stars, and a guy with a knife who also cuts hair. And through it all, people survived. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to keep the human species hobbling forward through plagues, famines, and questionable hygiene. So next time you're annoyed that your Wi-Fi is slow or your shower pressure isn't perfect, remember, at least your toilet isn't hanging over a moat. Up next in part 3, love, marriage, and why your spouse is probably your cousin. It's about to get romantic, in the weirdest way possible. You wake up, it's cold. It's always cold. You're lying on a straw mattress that smells faintly of goat, with a roof over your head made of thatch, mud, and divine intervention. You've got a leaky ceiling, fleas in your hair, and a strong suspicion that your neighbor's chickens are sleeping in your boots again. Congratulations. You live in the Middle Ages, but not the Middle Ages you've seen in movies. There's no gallant knight clanking through the courtyard, no bustling village marketplace full of rosy-cheeked maidens selling fresh apples and hand-woven cloaks. No, this is the real Middle Ages, where the average person hasn't bathed in a month. Literacy is reserved for monks, and the word toilet means somewhere vaguely downhill. Forget everything you've learned from Renaissance fairs. Life in medieval Europe, especially for peasants, was less Game of Thrones and more, please don't let me get dysentery today. Let's break it down. Housing. If you're lucky, you've got a one-room hut, shared with your entire family, plus a few animals. That's not a joke. Cows, pigs, chickens. These aren't just your food, they're your roommates. And believe me, they don't knock. There's no insulation, no windows, no privacy. Want to have a romantic moment with your spouse? Good luck doing it quietly while your mother-in-law churns butter 5 feet away. Clothing. Scratchy, drab, and designed more for survival than fashion. You've got one tunic. One. You wear it every day until it disintegrates, or someone dies and you inherit theirs. Undergarments are a luxury. Shoes are for Sundays, and if it rains, you just get wet. Deal with it. Food. You eat what you grow. That means porridge. Lots and lots of porridge. Occasionally bread. Maybe cabbage. If you're lucky, some dried peas. If you're really lucky, your lord lets you hunt a rabbit. If you're caught poaching his deer, hope you enjoy public execution because justice is swift and mildly theatrical. Also, no forks. Those wouldn't be common in Europe for another few centuries. You eat with your hands, or a knife if you're fancy. The table manners? Let's just say grunting counts as polite conversation. Now, about your job. You're a serf, which is like being a slave, except technically you're free, in the same way a hamster in a cage is free to run in its wheel. You work the land which belongs to a noble, who swears fealty to a bigger noble, who answers to a king, who answers to the Pope, who answers only to God, who, spoiler alert, doesn't help with your taxes. You don't own anything. Not your house, not your tools, not your crops, and certainly not your time. Every spring and fall, your Lord takes a chunk of your harvest. Not because he needs it, but because he can. It's good to be the guy with a sword. Your day starts at dawn. You plough fields, tend animals, collect firewood, carry water, make thatch, repair fences, harvest grain, and collapse in the mud. Then you get up and do it again and again until you die. Fun fact: Sunday is a holy day. That means no work, unless your Lord says otherwise, which he will. Education. What's that? If you're not a monk, you can't read. If you're not nobility, you can't write. You measure time by church bells and seasons. You know about the world only from gossip, sermons, and whatever the travelling peddler yells as he sells you suspicious sausages. The earth is flat, witches are real, and illness is caused by sin or a bad smell. Science, magic, maps, rare, books, priceless, and written in Latin, which you definitely don't speak. Entertainment? Don't get excited. No internet, no radio, no electricity. If you're lucky, there's a wandering bard who plays a 3-stringed lute and sings about a local sheep with an unusually shaped spot. That's your Netflix for the year. Most fun comes from community events, feast days, weddings, harvest festivals. You drink watered-down ale, eat suspicious meat pies, and dance until you forget your shoes. Then someone fights someone else over a goat. It's a party. Oh, and alcohol. Everyone drinks. Water isn't safe. Boiling it takes time and firewood, so people, including children, drink small beer or diluted wine. It's weak, but it keeps you from dying of cholera, so bottoms up. Religion is everywhere. God isn't a private belief. He's your landlord, your lawmaker, your doctor, and your babysitter. The church owns more land than the king. Priests are often the only people who can read. If you sin, no matter how minor, you could end up in purgatory forever. Unless you buy an indulgence with money you don't have. And death? Oh, it's coming. Plague, war, starvation, childbirth, infection, a stubbed toe gone wrong. You name it. Half of all children don't survive to adulthood. If you live past 5, congratulations. You're officially hard to kill. But don't worry, you probably won't make it past 40. And yet, people loved. They laughed. They told stories and played games and carved little wooden animals for their kids. They found joy where they could, even in the middle of endless mud and meaningless war, because humans are stubborn like that. So next time someone says they were born in the wrong era, show them this. Tell them about the lice, the teeth, the backbreaking labor, the goat in the bed, and the toilet that's just a hole over a pit of doom. Then hand them a jug of small beer and tell them to enjoy their porridge. Because life in the Middle Ages, it wasn't romantic. It was raw, dirty, and mostly terrible, and we've only just scratched the surface.